Hey guys, tonight we are going to take a little trip back in time to 17th century Paris. Imagine the glittering court of Louis XVI, the Sun King. We're talking peak opulence, perfume so thick you could taste it, and the constant, soft trussle of silken brocade. But we're not sticking to the grand ballroom. Oh no, we're going to wander off the pristine marble floors, down the back passages, and into the dark, muddy streets of the city. Think less champagne, more questionable potions. If I dropped you right into the middle of it, your biggest challenge wouldn't be court etiquette, but probably just surviving the first 24 hours without getting a weird rash or offending someone who carries more than just a handkerchief. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, maybe drop a comment letting me know what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where everyone is in the world as we start these late-night travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight but the smell. You're standing in a narrow, cobblestone alley somewhere in the heart of Paris. Around the year 1675, the air is a thick, soupy mess of wood smoke, baking bread, unwashed bodies, animal waste from the street, and overpowering everything, the desperate, cloying scent of cheap perfume and incense trying to mask the rot. This is the Paris that exists just beyond the gilded gates of the Louvre and the rising splendor of Versailles. Let's talk about Versailles for a moment because you need to understand the contrast. Out there, a few miles from where you're standing, Louis XVI, the Sun King, has built this gilded marvel not just as a home, but as a magnificent, inescapable stage. He is the director, the ladder and the sun around which every other planet that is, every noble in France is forced to orbit. By gathering all the powerful dukes, counts, and barons there, he could keep a very close eye on them, drowning their political ambitions in an endless sea of parties, ballets, and impossibly strict etiquette. Who has time to plot a rebellion when you're worried about whether the angle of your bow to the king was a degree off? It was a brilliant and exhausting system of control, but Versailles is a bubble, a beautiful, fragrant, golden bubble. And right now, you are standing outside of it. You're in the real world. The city of Paris is a labyrinth of over 20,000 houses crammed together, their upper floors leaning towards each other, almost kissing over the dark, narrow streets, blocking out what little sunlight there is. There's no sewer system to speak of, so you learn very quickly to walk close to the walls and listen for the cry of gardes low. Watch out for the water, which is a polite way of saying someone's about to dump the contents of their chamber pot out the window. You sidestep a particularly nasty-looking puddle, the mud sucking at the heel of your boot. This is a city of intense life and deep shadows. On the Pont Neuf, the new bridge, you see a chaotic cross-section of all of Paris merchants hawking their wares, tooth pullers promising painless extractions, next to scribes offering to write love letters for the illiterate. And here's a little detail for you: these public letter writers, the écrivaines publics, were the keepers of 1,000 secrets. For a few coins, they would write a letter for a servant girl to her family in the countryside, or a desperate plea for a loan, or a secret message to a lover. They heard everything, and in a city built on whispers, information like that was its own kind of currency. It's in these crowded, shadowy places that the other side of the Grand Siècle, the great century of French glory, truly thrives. While the philosophers of the age are talking about reason and enlightenment, the average person's life is governed by something much older: superstition, faith and fear. You see a woman discreetly tucking a small, folded paper charm into her bodice, bought from a street vendor who promised it would ward off illness. You hear men in a tavern speaking in inushed tones about a certain Fort Mutely in the Marais district, who can really see the future. And here's something historians still chew on: just how deep did the belief in magic and the supernatural run in a supposedly enlightened age, the official stance of the church and the crown was clear: witchcraft and divination were sins, crimes. But on the ground, the lines were blurry. Was a village healer using herbs and prayers a saint, or which was an alchemist trying to brew elixirs of long life, a scientist or a sorcerer? Academics still debate the extent to which the elite, the educated, and the powerful truly bought into these beliefs, or if they simply saw them as another tool to be used. The evidence we're about to uncover suggests that belief, or at least a willingness to exploit the belief, went all the way to the top. As dusk settles, the shadows in the alley deepen. Mountains are being lit, casting a flickering, unreliable glow. The noise of the city begins to change, the daytime bustle replaced by the sounds of revelry from taverns and something more furtive. It's a city of ambition, where everyone is clawing for a better position. A nobleman's younger son with no inheritance, a merchant's wife with a brutish husband, a courtier who just saw a rival get the promotion he coveted. What do you do when you're stuck, when the person standing between you and your happiness, your wealth, your freedom, simply won't go away? You pray, you hope, or you seek a different kind of help. A more permanent solution perhaps, one that comes in a small discreet vial. That small discreet vial. Let's talk about what's inside. It's not just a substance, it's a promise. A key. It goes by many names, whispered in hushed tones over card tables or during a clandestine meeting in a secluded garden grove. The most popular name, however, is chillingly direct powdery succession. The inheritance powder. The name itself tells you everything you need to know about its primary use case. It's a marketing masterstroke, really. It doesn't sound like a weapon. It sounds like a tool of destiny, a gentle nudge to help fate along its rightful course. You see, in the rigid world of 17th century France, your life was often a waiting game. If you were a younger son, you waited for your older brother to, have an unfortunate accident so you could inherit the title and lands. If you were married to a wealthy but cruel old man, you waited for nature to take its course, which could take an agonizingly long time. If you were a courtier, you waited for your rival to fall out of favor or, even better, fall silent. The inheritance powder was for people tired of waiting. It was the ultimate fast-forward button. The primary ingredient in many of these concoctions was arsenic, specifically arsenic triacate. It was the poison of choice for a few grimly practical reasons. First, it was difficult to detect. A small amount was colorless, odorless, and tasteless when mixed into a cup of wine or a bowl of hearty stew. Second, and this was its most brilliant feature, its effects mimicked a common and deadly illness of the time, gastric distress, or what they might call cholera morbus. The victim would suffer from violent stomach cramps, vomiting, and burning sensation, symptoms that could easily be attributed to a bad piece of fish or the will of God. A doctor might nod sympathetically, diagnose a fatal bout of tylic, and no one would be the wiser. It was, for a time, the perfect untraceable crime, so you're standing there in that dark alley, contemplating the little vial. You're not a monster. At least you don't think you are. You're just trapped. Every day, you have to smile at the man who holds your future in his hands, the one who blocks your path to happiness. Maybe it's your overbearing father who refuses to grant you your dowry. Maybe it's your file-undering husband who spends your money on his mistresses. Or maybe it's that smug-faced comte at court who just received the royal appointment that should have been yours. You've tried everything, pleading, praying, plotting. Nothing works, but this is different. This is a quiet, simple solution. A few drops, a few tasteless sprinkles, and then a period of socially mandated mourning, after which you are finally free. This brings us to a question that historians still argue about: just how commonplace was this kind of thinking? Was the Paris of this era a city where half the nobility was secretly fantasizing about a powdered solution to their problems? Or was this a fringe activity that just happened to snag some very famous clients? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The sheer number of poison suppliers who were eventually uncovered suggests the demand was frighteningly high. It seems that for a certain segment of society, murder by proxy had become a disturbingly normalized, if secret, to love's social advancement. Of course, with the fear of being poisoned came a thriving market for its opposite antidotes. And here's a wonderfully weird little fact for you. One of the most prized antidotes was a bezoar stone. A bezoar is a hard, rock-like mass found in the stomach of an animal, usually a goat or a gazelle, formed from layers of indigestible material. These were worth a fortune because it was widely believed that if you scraped a bit of the stone into your drink, or simply dip the stone into your wine. It would neutralize any poison present. Kings and popes had them set into rings and pendants. Imagine the paranoia a wealthy nobleman at a banquet, discreetly dipping his fancy bezoar ring into his soup before taking a spoonful, just in case his smiling host wasn't so friendly after all. It was a silent, paranoid arms race of toxins and telmisms. But a bezoar stone is a defense. It's a sign of fear. The powdery succession is an offense. And for a product this specialized, this dangerous, you wouldn't just buy it from any street corner charlatan. Oh no, you need a professional. Someone with a reputation for quality and, above all, discretion. You need an artist, a connoisseur of chemistry and human desperation. You need someone who understands the nuances of the dosage enough to be fatal, but slow enough to look natural. So where do you go? Who do you ask? You wouldn't dare speak of it aloud. Instead, you would listen. You'd listen for the whispers in the boudoir restaurant, the coded phrases exchanged in the gardens of the Palais Royal. And eventually, one name would surface again and again. A name spoken with a mixture of fear, reverence, and desperate hope. You'd hear of a woman, a so-called fortune utility, who ran a business that was far more lucrative than just reading palms. A woman who had built a veritable empire on the secret desires and deadly frustrations of Paris. She was the one you'd go to, if you had the nerve and the coin. The name you keep hearing whispered is Lavoisier. Catherine Monvoisin, to be precise, though everyone just calls her Lavoisier. The neighbor. It's a deceptively friendly, almost cozy-sounding name. Isn't it like the lady next door you'd borrow a cup of sugar from? Except in her case, you'd be borrowing something a little stronger. You learn that she holds court, not in some grand salon, but in a sprawling, comfortable house in the Villeneuve-sur-Gouffroy, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Paris. It's a place that's respectable enough not to draw unwanted attention, but close enough to the city's dark underbelly to conduct business. Let's be clear, Lavoisier is a phenomenal businesswoman. She's not some cackling crone stirring a cauldron in a shack. Think of her more as the CEO of a highly specialized, full-service illicit enterprise. Her public-facing business is fortune-telling and beauty products. Duchesses, actresses, and lawyers' wives alike flock to her. You might go to her for a reading of your palm, a glimpse into your future through chiromancy, or maybe to have your face read, a practice called physiognomies. She'd gaze at you with intelligent, assessing eyes, her voice calm and reassuring, and tell you exactly what you wanted to hear, that the promotion for your husband is just around the corner, that your rival for a lover's affection will soon lose interest. While you're there, perhaps you buy one of her famous beauty creams, or a pomade said to restore youth. Her house is a hive of activity. In one room, her daughter is selling face powders and rouge to a waiting line of clients. In another, furnaces are burning, tended by alchemists she has on her payroll, supposedly concocting elixirs of long life. She even sponsors artists and musicians, throwing lavish parties where the wine flows freely. She's created an entire ecosystem of services built around human desire, the desire to be beautiful, to be loved, to know the future, to live forever. But this is just the front office. The real money, the high-stakes game, happens in the back. Her client list is a who's who of Parisian society, and she understands them perfectly. She knows that beneath the silks and jewels, her wealthy patrons are often insecure, desperate, and ruthless. They don't just want to know the future, they want to change it. Her business empire is brilliantly structured. She doesn't do everything herself, she delegates. She is the central hub, the mastermind connecting a vast network of specialists. Needle of potion to make a certain courtier notice you, she has a supplier for that. Need a wax effigy of an enemy to stick pins and she knows a guy. Need an abortion, a service both illegal and highly dangerous, she has a discreet midwife on call. A woman named Catherine Leporet, who could take care of the problem. Of course, if you needed the ultimate solution, the powdery succession, she had a whole team of poison arrests and alchemists at her disposal. She's the general contractor for crime. One of the most fascinating and bizarre facts about her operation is the sheer scale and organization of it. This wasn't just one woman selling arsenic out of her kitchen. Lavoisier employed a small army of priests who were willing to perform sacrilegious rituals chemists who experimented with new toxic formulas, and a network of runners and spies who gathered information and delivered her products. One of her key suppliers was a man named Adam Lesage, a so-called magician who claimed to be able to summon demons. Another was an apothecary named Bell, who provided the raw materials. She built a criminal syndicate that would make a modern-day drug lord blush. Historians are still fascinated by the figure of Lavoisier herself. Was she a true believer in the magic she sold, or was she a cynical, brilliant fraud exploiting the superstitions of her era? Some accounts paint her as deeply pious in her own strange way, attending Mass daily even while arranging a sacrilegious black Mass for a client later that evening. Others see her as a pure pragmatist, a woman of low birth who, through sheer intelligence and nerve, clawed her way to wealth and influence in a society that gave her few legitimate paths to do so. The most likely answer is that she was a complex mix of both, a product of her time, who genuinely believed in the power of the supernatural, but was also shrewd enough to know a good business opportunity when she saw one. Imagine you're a potential client, finally getting a private audience. You're led past the public reception rooms into a more secluded chamber. The air is thick with incense. The decor is rich, designed to impress and intimidate. Lavoisier sits across from you, her expression unreadable. She listens patiently to your tale of woe, the cruel husband, the unfaithful lover, the blocking rival. She doesn't judge. She just listens, her mind like a calculator, assessing your desperation, your rank, and how much you're willing to pay. And when you've finished, she might offer a range of solutions, like a deadly menu. We could try a simple love charm first, she might suggest, her voice low and confidential. Or perhaps something to make your rival unlucky. She watches your eyes, gauging your reaction. And then, if she senses you're ready, she'll lean in a little closer and whisper, "All else fails, there is a more definitive way to ensure your happiness. The choice is yours." And as you sit there, in that dimly lit room, with the scent of strange herbs in the air, the line between right and wrong, between prayer and poison, starts to feel terrifyingly thin. You're not just buying a powder, you're buying a new future, custom-made by the most dangerous woman in Paris. Before Lavoisier's sprawling enterprise was brought to light, the Parisian authorities were already grappling with a case that felt like a disturbing prologue. It was a scandal that primed the public imagination for the horrors to come, a story that made every aristocrat glance nervously at their wine glass. It was the trial of Marie-Madeleine de Brinvilliers. Let's rewind a few years to 1672. You're in a courtroom, but the star defendant isn't there. She's on the run. The woman at the center of it all is the Marquise de Brinvilliers, a small, delicate-looking woman from a prominent noble family. To look at her, you'd think her incapable of swatting a fly. The story that unfolds, however, is one of cold, calculated poisonings that systematically dismantled her entire family. It all began, as these things so often do, with a forbidden love affair. The Marquise was trapped in an arranged, loveless marriage to a man she found dull and unremarkable. She took a lover, a dashing cavalry officer named Gaudin de St. Croix. This was hardly unusual in aristocratic circles, but her father, Andrew d'Aubray, a powerful civil servant, was scandalized. He used his influence to have St. Croix arrested and thrown into the Bastille. A classic heavy-handed patriarchal move, and it backfired spectacularly, because in the Bastille St. Croix didn't just sit and sulk. He shared a cell with an interesting character. This cellmate was a man named Dexolai, an Italian alchemist and, allegedly, a master poisoner. Historians still debate the true identity and skills of Exel, as some claim he was a state agent, others a common swindler. But whatever the truth, he seems to have given St. Croix a PhD in applied toxicology. When St. Croix was finally released, he came out not as a reformed lover, but as a man armed with deadly new knowledge, and he shared it with his beloved Marquise de Brinvilliers. Together they began to experiment, and here's where it gets truly chilling. To test the efficacy and dosage of their poisons, likely the same tasteless arsenic compounds we've discussed, Brinvilliers started to practice. She would visit hospitals, posing as a charitable noblewoman, a lady bountiful bringing broths and sweets to the sick and the poor. She would sit by their bedsides, offer them a comforting spoonful of soup laced with poison and watch. She observed how quickly the poison worked, what symptoms it produced, and how much was needed to be fatal without arousing suspicion. She turned the sick wards of Paris into her personal laboratory. Once she was confident in her methods, she turned her attention to her primary target, her father, the man who had imprisoned her, lovingly prepared meals, seasoned with a little something extra. His health declined slowly, baffling his doctors. He suffered from the exact kind of prolonged, agonizing stomach ailment that would be diagnosed as natural causes. He finally died in 1666. The Marquise inherited a significant sum and was free from his authority. No one suspected a thing, but she wasn't done. The inheritance was nice, but it had to be shared with her two brothers. So one by one they had to go. She arranged a dinner party, a seemingly friendly family gathering. During the meal, the pie was served. The Marquise, claiming a sudden lack of appetite, didn't touch it. Her brothers and the guest, however, enjoyed it. A short time later, both brothers were dead after suffering through the same hellish symptoms as their father. Her sister miraculously survived, perhaps because she ate a smaller portion or her constitution was stronger. The whole affair might have remained a dark family secret if not for a stroke of fate. Her partner in crime, Saint Croix, died suddenly in his laboratory in 1672, supposedly from accidentally inhaling the fumes from his own chemical experiments. A bit of cosmic irony there. Because he died without a will, the authorities were called to seal his belongings. They found a small, red leather box. Saint Croix had left specific instructions that this box should be delivered, unopened, to the Marquise de Brinvilliers. Of course, this was like putting a giant OP enemy sign on it for the police. They opened it. Inside, they found a collection of poison vials and, most damningly, a confession from Saint Croix detailing their crimes, along with all the letters the Marquise had written to him. It was a complete blueprint of their conspiracy. The game was up. Brinvilliers, getting word of the discovery, fled the country. But the story was out, and it created a panic. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in a fit of rage. This was systematic, patient, familial murder for profit, carried out by a member of the highest nobility. The idea that the person smiling at you across the dinner table could be slowly killing you terrified the French elite. It was a new kind of fear, an intimate terror. The case of the poisoning Marquis set the stage, creating a climate of suspicion and paranoia. The police now knew what to look for, and they were about to find that the Marquise de Brinvilliers wasn't an anomaly. She was just the tip of a very, very large and venomous iceberg, with the chilling tale of the Marquise de Brinvilliers echoing in the salons and taverns of Paris. The city is on edge. The idea of poison is no longer a distant, medieval horror, it's a modern, aristocratic threat. This is the charged atmosphere in which you find yourself making a decision. You've heard the whispers, you know the name Novoisan, and after weeks of sleepless nights and quiet desperation, you've decided to seek her out. You find your way to her house in Villeneuve-sur-Gravois. It's larger than you expected, buzzing with a strange energy. Carriages of wealthy patrons are discreetly parked a street away. You enter through a door that is opened by a severe-looking woman who sizes you up in a single, sweeping glance before leading you into a waiting room. The room is surprisingly tasteful. It's filled with people, mostly women, all trying very hard to look nervous. You see a well-known actress in one corner, her face veiled, and the wife of a prominent magistrate in another, fanning herself with agitated little flicks of her wrist. The air is thick with a strange cocktail of expensive perfume and palpable anxiety. After what feels like an eternity, you're summoned. You're not led to the main salon where Lavoisian performs her public fortune-telling, but down a quieter hallway into a smaller, more private chamber. The room is dimly lit, heavy curtains blocking out the afternoon sun. The furniture is dark ornate wood. On a small table, you see a human skull. Classic touch. Whether it's real or not is anyone's guess, but it certainly sets the mood. And there, sitting behind a large, cluttered desk, is Lavoisian herself. She's not what you pictured. She's a handsome woman in her 40s, her hair styled fashionably, her dress made of good quality fabric. She looks more like a prosperous merchant's wife than a sorceress. But her eyes are incredibly sharp. They seem to look right through you, seeing the ambition, the fear, and the ugly little secret you're carrying in your heart. She gestures for you to sit. Her voice, when she speaks, is calm and businesslike. "You are troubled," she says. "It's not a question." You begin to stammer out your story, the arranged marriage to a man old enough to be your grandfather, his cruelty, his jealousy, the way he keeps you a virtual prisoner while squandering your dowry. You tell her you fading away, your life draining out day by day. You tell her you dream of freedom. She listens without interruption, her expression unreadable. She just nods slowly, her gaze never leaving your face. It's an unnerving experience. You feel like she's heard this exact story 100 times before. When you finish, there's a long silence. The only sound is the ticking of a large clock in the corner. "There are," she says finally, choosing her words with care, "many paths to freedom." She leans forward slightly. "We could begin with a simple charm. A sachet of herbs to be placed under his pillow. 2. Soften his heart." She pauses, watching you. You know this is the first move in a delicate chess game. You shake your head. Too uncertain. "I see," she says, a flicker of something understanding approval in her eyes. "Perhaps something more direct is needed. A ritual to make him lose interest, to turn his attentions elsewhere. This is the next level. This involves magic, a ceremony, a greater cost." You hesitate, and in your hesitation she sees her opening. She rises and walks over to a heavy wooden cabinet. She unlocks it with a small, intricate key. The smell that wafts out is earthy and strange, a mix of dried herbs and chemical bitterness. She retrieves a tiny, sealed glass vial filled with a clear liquid. It's so small, you could hide it in the palm of your hand. She places it on the desk between you. Or she says, her voice now barely a whisper, "There is this. A solution for those who are tired of waiting for fate to be kind." She calls it a solution. "A release. A few drops," she explains, her tone practical, like a doctor prescribing medicine. "In his nightly cup of wine. The effect is gradual. He will feel tired, then weak. His stomach will trouble him. His own physician will speak of a natural decline. In a few weeks, you will be a widow. A wealthy, respectable, and above all free widow." And here's a detail that shows her genius for theatricality in psychology. The price she quotes is astronomical. This isn't just a transaction, it's an investment in your future. The high price serves two purposes. First, it makes the product seem more potent and reliable. Second, it makes you, the buyer, complicit. Once you've paid that much, you're not going to back out. You're fully committed. Historians still marvel at her business acumen. She understood branding, pricing, and client commitment on a level that was centuries ahead of her time. As you sit there, staring at the vial, 1,000 thoughts race through your mind. The risk, the guilt, but also the intoxicating possibility of a new life. Love always and doesn't pressure you. She simply sits back down, patient. She's given you the options. She's named the price. The final, terrifying step is yours to take. This is the moment of truth, the point of no return, in a small, dark room in a house on the edge of Paris, where futures are unwritten and rewritten for a price. As you sit there, hypnotized by the tiny, glittering vial, you realize that Lavoison's business model is far more diverse than simple inheritance powders. Poison was the most extreme option, the nuclear button of her service catalog. But for the vast majority of her clients, their problems were matters of the heart, not of inheritance. And for these, she offered a whole other suite of products. Love potion. The demand for love magic was immense, arguably even greater than the demand for poison. In a society where marriages were strategic alliances and personal choice was a luxury few could afford, genuine affection was a rare and precious commodity. Courtiers desperate to win the king's favor, ladies in waiting vying for the attention of a powerful duke, while merchants, wives hoping to rekindle a spark in a failing marriage, they all came to Lavoie's Anne. She would offer them a range of concoctions, often presented with a flair for the dramatic. These weren't just crude mixtures, they were branded products. You could buy celestial water to make you more attractive, or powders made from dried toads and bat's blood, ground into a fine dust to be secretly sprinkled onto a lover's food. One of her most popular ingredients was cantiche, better known as Spanish fly. It's a powder made from a species of blister beetle, a powerful irritant that was believed to be a potent aphrodisiac. In reality, it was incredibly dangerous, causing inflammation and, in high enough doses, kidney failure and death. It's a perfect example of Lavoisier's business philosophy: high risk, high reward, with a complete disregard for the well-being of the end user. But the real genius of her operation was combining these potions with powerful psychological manipulation. She wouldn't just sell you a vial of Spanish fly, she would sell you a whole ritual. She'd instruct you to administer the potion during a full moon while whispering a specific incantation. This ritualistic element made the client feel like they were an active participant in the magic, not just a consumer. It gave them a sense of control, an illusion of power in a powerless situation. And if the potions and charms failed, if the desired lover remained stubbornly indifferent, well, that's when Lavoisier would escalate to her premium service, the Black Mass. This is where her operation crossed the line from cynical fraud and dangerous chemistry into outright blasphemy and high treason, something that terrified the authorities far more than a simple poisoning. Imagine being ushered into a hidden chapel in the dead of night. This isn't a holy place. It's a perversion of one. The altar is draped in black. The crucifix is turned upside down. The candles are made of black wax, casting long, dancing shadows that make the room feel alive and menacing. The air is thick with acrid incense and a sense of profound transgression. And presiding over this ceremony is a defrocted priest, a man Lavoisier keeps on her payroll for just such occasions. One of her main go-to clergymen for this was a man named Etienne Guibourg. The client, often a high-ranking noblewoman, would be the centerpiece of the ritual. The ceremony was a twisted parody of a Catholic Mass. Prayers were recited backwards. Holy sacraments were desecrated. And here's a truly disturbing detail that came out in later testimonies sometimes. The altar was the naked body of the client herself, lying there while the priest performed his sacrilegious rites over her. It was the ultimate act of desperation, a complete rejection of God and society in favor of a pact with darker forces. The purpose of these masses varied. Some were performed to curse an enemy, some were to bind a lover. The most infamous ones, however, were petitions for love and power, specifically directed at the highest possible source, the king. A noblewoman might commission a black mass in the hopes of becoming the king's mistress, believing that this unholy ritual could influence the monarch's heart in a way that charm and beauty alone could not. Historians still debate the exact nature and frequency of these ceremonies. The testimony about them comes from frightened, imprisoned people trying to save their own necks, so a great deal of it might be exaggerated or fabricated. Did they really involve blood sacrifices, as some claim? The details are murky and contested, a blend of historical fact and hysterical confession. What is certain, however, is that enough people believed in the power of these rituals to pay enormous sums for them. It shows the psychological state of the elite. It was a cocktail of fervent Catholic faith and a deep-seated, pragmatic belief in its dark reflection. They believed God was powerful, so it stood to reason that the devil was too, and might be more willing to listen to their less than holy requests. So as you sit in Lavoisier's office, you understand that the vial of poison is just one tool in her arsenal. She is a master of human desire in all its forms. She offers solutions not just for hate but for love, not just for endings, but for beginnings. She can sell you a potion to win a heart, a powder to stop one, or a blasphemous ritual to control a destiny. Her house is a one-stop shop for the secret, desperate needs of the French court, a place where science, superstition, and psychology are blended into a uniquely profitable and deadly business. The Black Mass wasn't just a fringe service, it was the horrifying, sacrilegious heart of Lavoisier's most exclusive offerings. Let's pull back the curtain a little further on this particular ritual. Be warned, this is where things get truly dark and desperate. It's a side of the glittering 17th century that they definitely don't put in the glossy coffee table books about Versailles. You've decided against the simple poison vial. Your problem, you've explained to Lavoisin, is more complex. You don't want your husband dead, not yet. You want him to love you again. Or perhaps you are a courtier, and you desire not the death of your rival, but their disgrace. You want the king to look at you, to favor you. For this, Lavoisin tells you, a simple potion is not enough. You need to petition a higher, or rather, a lower power. She makes the arrangements. The appointment is for midnight, 3 days from now. You are to come alone and speak to no one. The cost she names is enough to buy a small house. You spend the next 3 days in a state of quiet terror and thrilling anticipation. This feels like the ultimate gamble. On the appointed night, you arrive at her property, but you are not led into the main house. Instead, you are guided through a dark garden to a secluded outbuilding, a small, windowless chapel she had specially constructed for these purposes. The air inside is cold and smells of damp earth and that same strange, heavy incense. Your heart is pounding. Everything about this place feels wrong. The scene is exactly as the rumors described. The inverted crucifix, the black candles sputtering and smoking. And waiting at the black draped altar is the priest. He is an old man, his face a roadmap of dissolution, but his eyes, when they meet yours, are sharp and unnerving. He reeks of stale wine and something else, something like burnt faith. The most shocking element, which I touched on before, is the use of a woman's body as the altar. If you were the one commissioning the Mass for love, this would be you. You would be instructed to lie upon the altar naked. Gui Borg would place his chalice on your stomach. Acolytes would hold black candles at your head and feet. It's an act of profound vulnerability and utter desecration, designed to break down every psychological and religious barrier. You are no longer in God's house, you are the vessel for an unholy petition. The ceremony begins. Gui Borg recites the Latin Mass, but with twisted, blasphemous alterations. The name of God is replaced with those of demons like Asmodeus and Astartoth. The prayers are not for salvation, but for seduction and ruin. He consecrates unholy wafers, dark, foul-smelling things. It's a meticulously crafted inversion of the most sacred ritual you know. And then comes the climax, the sacrifice. And here is where the testimonies become most horrifying and most contested. The most extreme accounts, given under duress by witnesses later, claimed that the sacrifice was an infant. They alleged that a network of illegal abortionists, like the one Lavoisin had on call, would supply and baptize newborns for these rituals. The priest would then, allegedly, conduct the sacrifice over the human altar, using the blood in his chalice. Now, we have to be extremely cautious here. This is a point of major academic debate. Did these infant sacrifices actually happen? Many historians are skeptical. The confessionals of the 17th century were not gentle places. The accused were under immense pressure, often tortured, and knew that confessing to even more heinous crimes could sometimes be a strategy, albeit a desperate one. The idea of infant sacrifice was also a classic trope, used for centuries to demonize heretical groups, from early Christians by the Romans to Jewish communities during the Middle Ages. So it's possible these stories were fabricated or wildly exaggerated by the accusers to make the defendants seem as evil as possible. Other historians argue that, given the sheer ruthlessness and desperation of some of the clients, we shouldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. The truth is, we will likely never know for sure what happened in that dark little chapel. What is more certain is that some form of blood sacrifice was likely involved, even if it wasn't the ultimate horror described. The use of animal hearts or other biological materials was common in folk magic. The point was the act of transgression, of using the very essence of lifeblood in a forbidden ritual to power the magical request. As the ritual concludes, you are left trembling, cold, and utterly drained. You've crossed a line from which there is no return. Gui Borg, the disgraced priest, is paid his fee. Lavoisin, who has been observing from the shadows, gives you a reassuring nod. She tells you the powers have been petitioned. Now, all you have to do is wait and watch for the results. You stumble out into the pre-dawn chill of Paris, the city lights just beginning to soften the darkness. The world looks the same, but you are different. You feel tainted, powerful, and terrified all at once. You have participated in an act so profoundly illegal and sinful that discovery would mean not just disgrace, but death. And you've done it all for a chance, just a chance at love, or power, or revenge. This is the service Lavoisian provided. She didn't just sell poison in a bottle, she sold the complete, terrifying experience of casting your lot with the darkness. So you have your vial of clear liquid, or perhaps you're still shaky from a dark ritual. You feel a strange sense of power. Why? Because you believe you possess a perfect, undetectable weapon. And for a long time, you would have been right. Let's take a moment to understand the science, or the 17th century version of it, that made this whole grisly business possible. The inheritance powders were so effective because forensics, as we know, it simply didn't exist. When someone died, the examination was, by our standards, incredibly superficial. A doctor, often a friend of the family, would be called in. He would look at the deceased, listen to the family's account of the final illness, the terrible stomach pains, the vomiting, the burning thirst, and he would nod gravely. These symptoms were tragically common. The culprit could be anything from dysentery and cholera to food poisoning from improperly stored meat. He would likely diagnose a bilious fever or a fatal colic, write a death certificate, offer his condolences, and leave. There was no autopsy, no toxicology report, no chemical analysis of the stomach contents. The cause of death was determined by observation and accepted medical wisdom, both of which were easily fooled by a skilled poisoner. The most popular poison, as we've mentioned, was arsenic triazcate, what they called white arsenic. It was a poisonous dream. It could be ground into a fine powder that dissolved in liquid with no color, or it could be mixed into solid food. The taste was said to be slightly sweet, easily masked by sugar or spices in a dish. A single, large dose would cause a rapid, violent death that might look suspicious. But the true artistry lay in the slow drip method, repeated doses over weeks or even months. Imagine the scenario. You're the long-suffering wife of a cruel nobleman. Every evening, you personally serve him his favorite spiced wine. And every evening, you adjust a pinch of the powder from Lavoisian. The first week, he complains of mild indigestion. The second week, he feels constantly tired and weak. By the third week, he has no appetite and suffers from bouts of nausea. You, of course, are the perfect, doting wife, constantly by his side, wringing your hands and calling for the doctor. The doctor is baffled. The nobleman is wasting away before his very eyes. Eventually, his system gives out. Everyone pities the poor nobleman for his long, mysterious illness, and they praise you for your saintly devotion during his final days. It was a masterpiece of domestic theater. And here's a bizarre little fact. Acquiring the raw materials was surprisingly easy. Arsenic was a common ingredient in a lot of everyday products. It was used as a rat poison which was sold quite openly. A woman could walk into an apothecary and buy a quantity of rat killer without raising too many eyebrows. It was also used in things like flypaper. You could buy sheets of sticky paper coated with an arsenic solution. Then simply soak the paper in water to extract the poison. It was hiding in plain sight. The real skill? The service that people like Lavoisian and her network of chemists provided was in the preparation and dosage. They were refining it, purifying it, and creating specific formulations for different purposes. One of their most infamous products was a liquid called eau de Brinvilliers, water named in honor of the notorious poisoning Marquise. It was a potent, ready-to-use solution, probably a mixture of arsenic and antimony dissolved in water or alcohol. But the world of 17th century toxicology wasn't limited to arsenic. The poisoneresses had a whole apothecary of deadly substances at their disposal. There was aconite, also known as wolfsbane, a fast-acting poison that could cause heart failure. There was hemlock, the poison famously used to execute Socrates. And there was belladonna, or deadly nightshade, whose berries could be used to create a poison that caused delirium and hallucinations before death. The alchemists in Lavoisian's employ were constantly experimenting, trying to create new compounds that were even more subtle and harder to detect. The question of how much these alchemists truly understood the chemistry they were working with is another one of those points of academic debate. Were they following ancient, mystical recipes, or were they engaging in a form of early, empirical science? The line between alchemy and chemistry was still very blurry. Many of them were likely working from a combination of traditional knowledge, trial and error, and pure guesswork. They didn't know about atomic weights or chemical bonds, but they knew that if you mix substance A with substance B and heated it, you got something that would kill a cat. It was a results-oriented business. This perceived invincibility of poison created a deep, corrosive paranoia at the highest levels of society. People of wealth and power started to take elaborate precautions. They would only eat from common dishes, never from a portion served specifically to them. Some employed food tasters. The king himself had a whole team of officials whose job was to oversee the preparation and serving of his meals, a system called the bouche du roi. Every dish was prepared under guard and delivered in a locked container. It's a striking image, the most powerful man in Europe, the Sun King, living in constant, low-grade fear that his next meal might be his last. This fear was the fertile ground in which Lavoisin's business grew. She wasn't just selling death, she was profiting from the terror it inspired. For years, this dark arts and crafts industry operated with horrifying success in the shadows of Paris. The authorities knew something was wrong. There was a statistical anomaly, a subtle but disturbing uptick in sudden deaths among the wealthy, often conveniently timed around inheritances or marital disputes. They could feel the sickness in the city, but they couldn't see the pathogen. That is, until the arrival of a man who would change everything, Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine. Imagine a 17th century version of a determined, incorporate police commissioner from a modern crime drama. That was Lorraine. In 1667, Louis XIV appointed him as the first Lieutenant General of Police of Paris. This was a brand new position, created specifically because the city had become a chaotic, dangerous mess. Before Lorraine, law enforcement was a confusing patchwork of jurisdictions and private guards. He was tasked with bringing order to this chaos, and he took his job very, very seriously. He was a man of contradictions. He was deeply cultured, a lover of books and fine art, but he was also ruthless and had a stomach for the grim realities of his work. He introduced the first public street lighting system in Paris, thousands of lanterns in glass-cased frames which earned Paris the nickname La Ville Lumière, the City of Light. But his goal wasn't just aesthetic, it was about security. Criminals love darkness, and Lorraine was determined to take it away from them. He also created a professional police force with inspectors' uniforms and a clear chain of command. He was, in essence, inventing modern policing. Lorraine was the man who had overseen the investigation into the Marquise de Brinvilliers. That case had opened his eyes. It showed him that the greatest threats to the king's order weren't just common thieves and cutthroats in the alleys, but also smiling, well-dressed aristocrats in their drawing rooms. He became obsessed with the idea of a hidden network of poisoners, a criminal underworld that serviced the elite. He started pulling at the threads, collecting whispers and rumors, patiently building a file. His big break came from an unexpected source. He was investigating a group of counterfeiters and, in the process, his men arrested a man named Louis de Van Ens, a former nobleman who had fallen on hard times. While interrogating Van Ens about forgery, they stumbled upon something much bigger. Van Ens started talking. He talked about his involvement in alchemy, about his connections to people who could provide more than just fake money. Marie Bosse was a contemporary of Lavoisin, but she was small-time, a lower-level player in the same game. She was known among the city servants and lower-class women as someone who could read cards and provide certain potions. One day she made a fatal mistake. She attended a party and, after having a little too much wine, she started to boast. In front of several witnesses, she bragged that she had made enough money from selling poisons to retire in luxury. She allegedly said, "What a great business, 3 inheritances in a row, and I can buy my own estate." A lawyer who was present at the party, a man named Maître Perrin, was horrified and went straight to the police. This was the opening Lorraine had been waiting for. He didn't just rush and arrest her. He was smarter than that. He devised a sting operation. He found a woman, the wife of one of his own police officers, a Madame Vautier. She was to pose as a potential client, a desperate wife who wanted to be rid of her husband. She went to see Marie Boss, spun a convincing sub-story, and asked, smelling a wealthy new client, took the bait. She sold the undercover officer a vial of her deadliest product. The trap was sprung. In early 1679, Lorraine men raided Marie Boss's house. They found her daughter, and several of her associates. And when they started questioning them, the floodgates opened. Boss, realizing she was caught red-handed, began naming names, hoping to get a lighter sentence by cooperating. She talked about her suppliers, she talked about her clients, and most importantly, she talked about her main rival, the biggest fish in the entire poison pond, Lavoisier. Here's a small, telling detail about Lorraine's methods. He kept meticulous, detailed records of every interrogation. These transcripts, many of which survive today, are our primary window into this whole affair. They are filled with the desperate, terrified voices of the accused, but also with the calm, persistent, probing questions of Lorraine and his investigators. He wasn't just looking for convictions, he was a methodical information gatherer, trying to map out the entire criminal network. Historians still study these documents, debating their reliability. Are they a true record, or were the confessions shaped by the investigators' expectations and, in some cases, by torture? It's a question that hangs over the entire investigation, a reminder that the truth we have is filtered through the mechanisms of 17th century justice. For Lorraine, the confession of Marie Boss was the key that unlocked the whole conspiracy. He now had a direct line to the woman who was supposedly at the center of it all. He knew that arresting Lavoisier would be a delicate operation. She was well connected with clients at every level of society. He had to move carefully, but quickly, before she got wind that her little world was about to come crashing down. The stage was set for the takedown of Paris's most successful and dangerous entrepreneur. With the confessions of Marie Boss and her circle acting as a detailed map, Lorraine's investigation gained a terrifying momentum. It was no longer a matter of chasing whispers and rumors. He now had names, dates, and locations. He began to see the true shape of the conspiracy, and it wasn't a single iceberg, but a whole archipelago of interconnected criminal enterprises, all linked by the exchange of poisons, magical services, and secrets. As everyone he arrested confirmed was Lavoisier. Lorraine's police force, the one he had built from the ground up, began a series of coordinated, lightning-fast raids. Imagine you're one of the lower-level players in Lavoisier's network, perhaps a disillusioned chemist who mixed powders for her, or a midwife who disposed of inconveniences. For years, you felt untouchable, protected by the secrecy and the powerful clients you served. Then, one evening, there's a hard knock on your door. It's a squad of Lorraine's archers, the city police. There's no escape. The nets swept up a bizarre and diverse cast of characters. They arrested alchemists, fought mutineers, and defrauded priests like Etienne Gui Borg. They arrested apothecaries who had knowingly sold the raw materials for poison. They arrested engravers who forged inheritance documents. Each arrest led to more interrogations, and each interrogation led to more names. Lorraine was pulling on a single thread, and the entire tapestry of the Parisian underworld was unraveling. The prisoners were taken to the Bastille or the fortress of Vincennes, kept in isolation to prevent them from coordinating their stories. Lorraine himself often led the interrogations. He would play his prisoners against each other, telling one that their partner had already confessed everything, a classic but effective technique. He would offer deals, hinting at lighter sentences in exchange for full cooperation. And, when he felt it necessary, he would use the methods of his time. This is an uncomfortable but crucial part of the story: the use of torture. The legal system of 17th century France permitted the question, a chillingly euphemistic term for judicial torture, to extract confessions. The most common method was the broad quin, or the boot. This was a device where the prisoner's legs were placed between wooden planks, and wedges were then hammered in, crushing the bones. It was brutal, agonizing, and often produced whatever confession the interrogators wanted to hear, which is why historians must treat these confessions with such caution. We must constantly ask, is this the truth? Or is this just what a person in unimaginable pain would say? To make it stop, this debate over the validity of torture-induced testimony is central to understanding the affair of the poisons. As the interrogations continued, a pattern began to emerge. The suspects, under pressure, all started pointing upwards towards the wealthy, noble clients who had hired them. At first it was minor courtiers, the wives of financiers and struggling actors. But then more prominent names began to surface. A duchess was accused of buying a potion to secure her husband's love. The scandal was creeping closer and closer to the glittering heart of the kingdom, the court of Versailles. La Reine realized he was in a precarious position. This was no longer a simple criminal investigation. It was becoming a political powder keg. Accusing a common fort in Italy was one thing, accusing a duke or a high-ranking lady in waiting was another. He was walking a tightrope. If he pushed too hard, he could anger some of the most powerful people in France, people who had the king's ear. If he didn't push hard enough, he would be failing in his duty to uncover the full extent of the wrath. Here's a small, telling detail that illustrates the growing panic as word of the arrest spread. There was a sudden and notable increase in people attending confession at churches all over Paris. It seems many people with guilty consciences were trying to get right with God before La Reine got to them. There were also reports of individuals hastily burning papers and burying small boxes in their gardens. The fear was palpable. La Reine's web was meticulously constructed. He was a patient fisherman, letting out the line, feeling the weight of the catch before he started to reel it in. He knew he needed an absolutely airtight case before he made his move on the central figure. He collected testimony from dozens of sources, cross-referencing their stories, looking for inconsistencies, building a mountain of evidence. He wanted to ensure that when he finally moved on Lavoie's Anne, she would have no way to escape, no powerful friend who could intervene on her behalf. The atmosphere in Paris was thick with paranoia. Who would be next, whose name would be whispered in the dungeons of the Bastille? Every carriage that stopped unexpectedly, every sideways glance from a servant, could be a sign of impending doom. The web, which had been invisible for so long, was now visible, its strands glinting in the new light of La Reine's lanterns. And everyone could see that all the strands led to one place, the comfortable, respectable-looking house in Villeneuve-sur-Gravois, where the queen of this shadow economy was about to receive the visit she had always known might one day come. The day La Reine chose to finally move on Lavoie's was March 12, 1679. It was a carefully timed operation. He knew that she was a creature of habit and deep, if twisted piety. He waited until she was leaving her house to attend mass at a nearby church. The arrest needed to be clean, public, and undeniable, leaving no room for her to slip away or for her powerful clients to whisk her into hiding. Imagine the scene. Lavoisian steps out of her front door, dressed in her finest clothes for church. She is, at this moment, at the absolute peak of her power and wealth. Her business is thriving, her clients are among the most powerful people in the kingdom. She is a respected figure in her neighborhood, a woman of means. As she walks towards the church, she is perhaps contemplating her accounts, or the arrangements for her next lavish party. She is confident, secure. Then a carriage blocks her path. The doors fly open, and out step La Reine's archers. There's no struggle, no dramatic chase. She is a middle-aged woman, not a fugitive. She is simply informed that she is under arrest by order of the king. Her face, according to eyewitnesses, showed not fear, but a kind of weary resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. Perhaps for her, it was less a shock and more the inevitable conclusion of the dangerous game she had been playing for years. The news of her arrest sent a shockwave through Paris and, more importantly, through the gilded halls of Versailles. It was an earthquake. For the lower-level players in her network, it was a signal that the game was truly over. For her clients, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Lavoisian knew everything. She knew their names, their secrets, their darkest and most desperate acts. She held the reputations, and indeed the lives, of hundreds of aristocrats in her hands. Her silence was the only thing protecting them. And now she was in the custody of the most tenacious investigator in France. She was taken immediately to the fortress of Insomnia, a grim, imposing castle just outside Paris, and placed in solitary confinement. Lorraine knew he had to break her, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Lavois and was not like the other, more minor figures he had interrogated. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and she understood the power of the information she held. Her initial interrogations were a masterclass in defiance. She played the part of the misunderstood healer and fought neutrally. Poisons never. Black mass is an absurd fabrication by her jealous rivals. She admitted to telling fortunes, to selling beauty creams, to offering harmless charms. She was, she claimed, a victim of slander. She was calm, articulate, and utterly convincing. She was trying to build a firewall, admitting to the lesser, which carried a lighter penalty, while denying the capital offenses of poisoning and sacrilege. But Lorraine was patient. He had time. And he had a mountain of evidence from the dozens of other prisoners he held. He began to confront her with their testimony. He would read her the confession of one of her alchemists, detailing the specific poisons they had mixed for her. He would present the testimony of a noblewoman's servant, who swore she had delivered a payment to Lavois and for a powder to ensure a swift inheritance. He chipped away at her defenses, piece by piece, day after day. Here's a small, telling detail from her imprisonment that reveals her character. Knowing that her high-ranking clients would be panicking, she attempted to use her one remaining connection to the outside world, her daughter. She tried to smuggle a message out to her, a list of her most important clients who should be warned. The message was intercepted. It was a critical mistake, providing Lorraine with a partial client list in her own handwriting. The debate among historians about Lavois and psychology during her captivity is fascinating. Was her initial defiance a calculated legal strategy, or did she, on some level, believe her own carefully constructed public persona? Some scholars argue that she possessed a kind of compartmentalized morality, genuinely seeing her good works like her charity and patronage of the arts as balancing out the darker side of her business. She may have convinced herself that she was merely a service provider, not truly responsible for what her clients did with her products. It's a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to live with her choices. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure mounted. The isolation, the relentless questioning, and the knowledge that her entire network had collapsed began to take their toll. She saw that denial was a failing strategy. She began to talk, but she was strategic. She would confess, but only two things Lorraine already knew from other sources. She would confirm the stories about lesser clients, sacrificing pawns to protect the kings and queens on her chessboard. She was still trying to control the narrative, to manage the fallout, to protect her most powerful and most dangerous patrons. But Lorraine knew she was holding back. He knew the biggest secrets were yet to be revealed, and he was determined to get them. The sheer volume of arrests and the explosive nature of the confessions created a serious problem for King Louis XIV. This was no longer a simple police matter that could be handled by the regular courts. The existing legal system was too slow, too public, and frankly, too vulnerable to the influence of the powerful aristocrats who were now being implicated. The king needed a special tool, a legal instrument that was swift, secret, and entirely under his control. So, in April 1679, he reached back into French history and revived a controversial and feared institution that translates to the burning chamber. The name alone was designed to inspire terror. It came from the fact that in its earlier incarnations, the courtroom used to be draped in black and lit only by torches or candles, giving it a grim, fiery glow. It was a special tribunal. Established by royal decree to deal with extraordinary crimes that threatened the state like heresy, treason, and in this case, widespread poisoning. Setting up the chamber ardente was a clear signal from the king this was a purge. He was taking this threat with the utmost seriousness, and he was creating a dedicated, high-powered court to deal with it. The court was composed of some of the most senior judges and legal minds in the kingdom, including Lorraine himself, who served as the chief prosecutor and rapporteur, summarizing the evidence for the judges. This meant the man who led the investigation was also presenting the case in court, a clear conflict of interest by modern standards but perfectly normal at the time. The proceedings of the Chamber Ardente were held in secret. There was no public gallery, no prying journalists. The testimony was heard behind closed doors at the Arsenal in Paris. This secrecy served two purposes. First, it prevented the sordid details from becoming public gossip, which could tarnish the image of the French nobility and, by extension, the king himself. Louis XIV was obsessed with glory and the reputation of his reign. He didn't want it to be remembered for a squalid scandal about poison and black magic. Second, the secrecy protected the names of the high-ranking individuals who were being accused until the king could decide how to handle them. It gave him control over the flow of information. As the trials began, the court processed the lower-level figures first, the fortune utiliers, the alchemists, the back alley potion makers. The evidence against them was often overwhelming, based on the interlocking confessions Laurent had so patiently gathered. The sentences were harsh. Many were sentenced to be flogged, branded, or banished from the kingdom. The most culpable were condemned to death. One of the bizarre and less known aspects of the Chamber Ardente was its attempt to also legislate against the tools of the trade. The court, on the king's orders, issued edicts that placed severe restrictions on the sale of toxic substances. It became illegal for apothecaries or chemists to sell arsenic and other poisons to private individuals without a formal, written order from a known physician. They had to keep detailed records of who bought what and for what purpose. This was one of the first real attempts at comprehensive drug control in Europe, a direct legal consequence of the panic Lavois and her colleagues had created. But, as the trials progressed, a fundamental tension within the court's mission became apparent. Was its purpose to deliver impartial justice for all, regardless of rank, or was its primary function to protect the king and the stability of the state? Even if that meant burying the most inconvenient truths, this question is something historians still actively discuss. The early proceedings suggested genuine effort at justice, but as the investigation climbed the social ladder, the court's actions became more and more political. The judges of the Chamber Ardente found themselves in an impossible position. They were hearing testimony under oath that implicated some of the most powerful people in France. A trembling, tortured prisoner would whisper the name of a duchess, who was a close friend of the queen, or a duke who commanded one of the king's armies. What were they to do with this information? To ignore it would be a dereliction of their duty. To act on it could plunge the court into a political crisis. They began compiling what became known as the Poisons List, a secret register of all the high-ranking individuals who had been named in the confessions. This list was for the king's eyes only. It was a document of pure political dynamite. Louis XIV would review the list with Laurent and his chief ministers, deciding on a case-by-case basis who would be publicly prosecuted, who would be privately reprimanded, and whose name would be quietly suppressed to avoid a greater scandal. The Chamber Ardente, which began as an instrument of justice, was slowly transforming into a tool of political damage control. It was a demonstration of the absolute power of the monarch. Justice in the age of Louis XIV was not a blind concept, it was a function of the king's will. And as the interrogations of Lavois and unhurt up lieutenants continued, a name was about to be spoken that would test the limits of the king's will, a name so close to the throne that it threatened to bring the entire scandal crushing into the king's own bedchamber. Inside the cold, oppressive interrogation rooms of the Bastille and Vincennes, the carefully constructed walls of silence were grumbling. Laurent's methodical pressure was working. One by one, the key figures in Lavois's network began to break, their defiance replaced by a desperate scramble to save their own lives, and the stories they told were breathtaking. The first major domino to fall was Adam Lesage, the so-called magician and alchemist who had been one of Lavois's main associates. Under intense questioning, unlikely the threat of torture, he began to sing. He recounted the black masses, the love potions, the poisons, and he started naming clients with reckless abandon. He spoke of aristocrats, financiers, and actors, painting a picture of a Parisian elite riddled with superstition and homicidal ambition. Then came the priest, old, frail, and terrified. He confessed to his role in the sacrilegious ceremonies. He described the inverted crucifixes, the desecrated hosts, and the blasphemous prayers. His testimony was particularly damning because, as a priest, His words carried a twisted kind of authority. He corroborated the stories of the black masses, giving them a chilling reality that was hard to dismiss as mere fantasy. But the most significant confessions came from Lavoisier herself and her daughter, Marguerite Mauvoisin. After months of denial and strategic omissions, Lavoisier's composure finally cracked. Perhaps it was the mounting evidence, the psychological toll of imprisonment, or the realization that her powerful clients were not going to save her. She began to talk, and the secrets she had guarded for so long started to spill out. She didn't confess in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, calculated release of information. She would admit to one crime, then another, each confession pulling the investigators deeper into the labyrinth of her operations. She confirmed the stories of the poisons, the inheritance powders, and described how she would advise her clients on their use. She detailed her vast network, explaining who supplied the chemicals, who performed the rituals, and who delivered the final product. Her daughter, Marguerite, proved to be an even more valuable witness. She had grown up in the business. From a young age, she had seen the clients come and go, she had heard the whispered requests. She had helped manage the accounts. She had fewer of her mother's hardened defenses and, facing the prospect of her own execution, she was more willing to cooperate fully. Her testimony was a goldmine for Lorraine. She had a good memory for names and faces. It was during these sessions in the dim, torchlit rooms of the prison that the truly shocking names began to be uttered. The investigators would have leaned in, their pens scratching furiously on parchment, as Marguerite or one of the others mentioned a name, like the Duchess of Bouillon, one of the most flirtatious and high-spirited women at court, or the Count of Soissons, or even more alarmingly, the Duke of Luxembourg, one of France's most brilliant and successful military commanders. The accusation against the Duke of Luxembourg was particularly explosive. He was a Marshal of France, a war hero. He was accused of making a pact with the devil with the help of Lavoisier's network to ensure his military victories and to eliminate a rival for a common post. This was bordering on treason. To suggest that a Marshal of France owed his success not to skill in God's favor, but to black magic, was a direct challenge to the narrative but to glory. Historians still debate the truth of these specific accusations. Were powerful men like Luxembourg really dabbling in the occult, or were their enemies using the scandal to settle old scores? It's a classic problem in a climate of hysteria and paranoia. It's incredibly easy to destroy someone's reputation with a well-placed, unverifiable accusation. A rival could bribe a prisoner to mention the Duke's name during an interrogation, a tactic that was almost impossible to defend against. How do you prove you didn't attend a black mass? As the poisons list grew longer and more illustrious, Louis XIV became increasingly alarmed. The scandal was no longer a fire contained in the back alleys of Paris, it was a wildfire approaching the gates of Versailles. He could handle the disgrace of a few minor nobles. But this was different. This was implicating the very pillars of his kingdom, his generals, his courtiers, the women who moved in the most intimate circles of the royal family. And then the ultimate name was spoken. A name that would have made every man in the room freeze. It probably came from Marguerite, or perhaps from Message, or even from Lavoisier herself in a moment of final, desperate confession. They began to talk about their most important client, a woman who had paid them more money than anyone else. A woman who hadn't just bought a simple love potion but had commissioned the most elaborate and blasphemous rituals, again and again over many years. A woman whose singular goal was to secure and maintain the love of the most powerful man in the world, the king himself. They named the king's official chief mistress, the mother of several of his legitimized children. The magnificent and powerful France was Athena Isdorot Stuart de Mortemart, better known to the world as Madame de Montespan. The name, once spoken, hung in the air of the interrogation room like a shroud. Madame de Montespan. It was the name Lorraine had probably been dreading and expecting in equal measure. This wasn't just another duchess or a disgruntled courtier. This was, for all intents and purposes, the uncrowned Queen of France. And now, a gaggle of prisoners in a dungeon were accusing this magnificent woman of the most heinous crimes. The story they told was a sordid tale of obsession and magical coercion. According to the confessions of Lavoisier, her daughter Marguerite, the priest Gui Bob, and the magician Lesage. Madame de Montespan had been one of their earliest and most loyal clients. The story began, they claimed, back when she was just beginning her campaign to win the king's love. Desperate to oust her rival, Louise de la Valliere, Montespan had allegedly turned to Lavoisier for help. She didn't start with poisons, she started with love potions. The witnesses described how she would buy powders and philters, which she would then administer to the king. And here's a particularly squirm-inducing and likely exaggerated detail that came out in the testimony. They claimed she would have the potions secretly mixed into the king's food and drink, sometimes by sympathetic servants. One of the more lurid tales involved love powders made from ingredients like Spanish fly and dust from dried moles, which Montespan herself would supposedly sprinkle onto a piece of meat with her own hands before it was served to the king. As her relationship with the king blossomed, her reliance on the occult allegedly deepened. She became terrified of losing his affection. The court at Versailles was a shark tank, with dozens of beautiful young women vying for the king's attention. Montespan, according to the prisoners, lived in a constant state of anxiety, seeing rivals everywhere. To maintain her position, she supposedly escalated her request to Lavoisier. This is when the black masses came into play. The confessions painted a truly blasphemous picture. They claimed that Montespan had commissioned multiple black masses with the priest Gui Borg, with the specific intention of binding the king's love to her forever. The most infamous accounts described her lying on the altar herself, a chalice on her belly, while Gui Borg performed the sacrilegious rites, praying to demons to keep the king obsessed with her. The petitions allegedly grew darker, asking not just for the king's love, but for the disgrace of her rivals and even for the death of the queen, Maria Theresa, so that she herself might marry Louis. The most damning accusations, however, went beyond love magic. The witnesses claimed the winner knew. Younger rival did manage to capture the king's eye. Montespan's requests turned murderous. They accused her of purchasing poisons from Lavoisier, not for the king, but with the intent of eliminating her competitors. They specifically mentioned a young woman who had recently enchanted the king, and they alleged that Montespan had tried, and failed, to have her poisoned. This brings us to a crucial point of historical debate. Is the story true? It's the million-dollar question of the affair of the poisons. On one hand, the testimonies of multiple, independent witnesses, all telling a similar story, are compelling. They knew details about Montespan's life and anxieties that seemed convincing. On the other hand, these witnesses were desperate people trying to save themselves. Accusing the king's mistress was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. Desperate act of truth-telling, or it could be a calculated gamble to create a scandal so enormous that the king would be forced to shut the whole investigation down to protect his own reputation. Furthermore, Montespan had many enemies at court who would have been delighted to see her or and may have influenced the testimony. Academics are split. Some historians believe the accusations were largely true, that Montespan was a deeply superstitious and ruthless woman, a product of her age, who used every tool at her disposal to maintain power. Others argue that the story is a fabrication, a smear campaign of epic proportions, built on the coerced confessions of terrified prisoners. The truth is likely lost to time, buried under layers of testimony, torture, and political maneuvering. But for now, imagine you are Laura A. holding these depositions in your hand. The ink on the parchment seems to sizzle. The implications are staggering. The woman sleeping in the king's palace, the mother of his children, might be a client of a diabolical criminal ring, a participant in blasphemous rituals, and potentially an aspiring murderer. He now had to take this information to the one person who could decide what to do with it, the Sun King himself. The moment Laura Amy presented his findings to Louis IV must have been one of the most tense and dramatic meetings of the king's long reign. We can only imagine the scene: a private study in the Palace of Versailles, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and secrets. Outside, the meticulously manicured gardens stretched out, a symbol of order and control. Inside, Laura was presenting a report that described pure chaos. a rot that had spread from the darkest alleys of Paris to the very heart of the king's own court. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was a man whose entire life was a performance of absolute power and divine authority. He had cultivated an image of himself as a semi-divine being, the center of the universe, a ruler whose judgment was as flawless as his taste. He was a devout Catholic, attending Mass daily. He saw himself as God's chosen representative on earth. Now, he was being told that his glorious reign, the one he had built on principles of order, faith, and reason, was entangled with the world of back-alley witchcraft, poison, and demonic pacts. His reaction would have been a complex storm of emotions. First, there would have been pure, cold fury. The idea that his will, his affections, could be manipulated by crude love potions and blasphemous rituals was a profound insult to his very being. It suggested he was not a master of his own destiny, but a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a fortnightly and a disgraced priest. For a man obsessed with control, this was the ultimate violation. Then there would have been a deep, personal sense of betrayal. He had loved Madame de Montespan. He had showered her with wealth, titles, and affection. He had legitimized their children, giving them a status just below his own legitimate heirs. He had built a life with her. To hear that this entire relationship might have been founded on a bedrock of magic and deceit would have been a devastating personal blow. He would have had to look back on years of tender moments and question everything. Was her wit a natural gift, or was it sharpened by a demonic pact? Was her passion for him genuine, or was it the product of a potion mixed into his wine? And beneath the anger and the hurt, there would have been a chilling fear. Not a physical fear, but a political one. This scandal had the power to destroy his legacy. It made him look weak and foolish, a dupe controlled by his mistress. It tarnished the image of his court, making it look like a nest of vipers and occultists. In an age where the mystique of monarchy was crucial to love power, this was an existential threat. Enchanted by love powders bought from a witch, it sounded like a cheap fable, yet it was the conclusion of his own chief of police. Here's a small detail that shows the king's state of mind after hearing the accusations. His personal physician started keeping an even closer, almost paranoid watch over his food and drink. The fear of poison, which had always been a background hum at court, became a loud, screaming alarm. The king, who had once dined with gusto, was now forced to view every meal with suspicion. The question of whether Louis XIV believed the accusations against Montespan is one of the great psychological mysteries of the affair. Did he, a man of the enlightened 17th century, truly believe in the efficacy of black masses and love charms? It's a point on which historians differ. Some argue that, like most of his contemporaries, he existed in a world where the supernatural was an accepted reality. He may not have believed a potion could magically create love from nothing, but he might have believed it could be an instrument of the devil, used to tempt and corrupt. Others suggest that his belief is irrelevant. What mattered was that she had believed in it. The act of turning to these dark forces was, in itself, an unforgivable betrayal and an act of lèseme, a geste, an offense against the king's majesty. Her lack of faith in him, and her turn towards forbidden powers, was the real crime. Faced with this crisis, Louis had to make a decision. His first instinct might have been to let justice run its course, to have Montespan arrested and tried by the chambre ardente like any other suspect. But he quickly would have realized that was impossible. A public trial of the king's mistress would be a global spectacle. It would air all the dirty laundry of the court for the whole world to see. It would mean his own children's mother being publicly branded a witch and a poisoner. The scandal would be catastrophic, not just for the monarchy, but for the stability of France. So he made a choice. It was not a choice for justice, but for survival. He had to contain the fire. He had to bury the most damning evidence and silence the most dangerous witnesses. The investigation had gone too far. It was time for the king to intervene, not as a seeker of truth, but as a master of damage control. He gave a new, secret order to La Reine and the judges of the chambre ardente. The full-scale purge was over. The cover-up was about to begin. Let's try to step into Madame de Montespan's shoes for a moment. Imagine you are the most powerful woman in France, second only to the Queen, who you have effectively sidelined. For over a decade, You have been the sun around which the court of the Sun King orbits. Your wit sets the standard, your style is endlessly copied, and your rooms at Versailles are the true center of power. You have bested every rival, secured your children's futures, and won the enduring, if not always exclusive, love of the most powerful man in the world. And then, it all starts to unravel. Your first sign that something is wrong is a subtle shift in the king's demeanor. The easy intimacy you once shared begins to cool. He seems distant, preoccupied. His gaze, which once held only adoration, now seems to carry a hint of suspicion, of something cold and appraising. You try to charm him, to amuse him with your famous wit, but the jokes fall flat. The atmosphere between you becomes strained, heavy with unspoken words. Then the rumors start. At first, they are just whispers, slithering through the gilded corridors of Versailles. Whispers about arrests in Paris, about a fortunately named Lavoie's Anne. You know the name, of course. A faint, cold knot of dread begins to form in your stomach. You tell yourself it's nothing, a common criminal affair that has nothing to do with you. But the whispers grow louder. You start hearing the names of people you know, minor courtiers, ladies in waiting, people who have visited the same discreet townhouses in Paris as you have. The net is closing, and the dread is no longer faint. It's a constant, chilling companion. You see people watching you in the halls of the palace. Are they admiring you, or are they wondering if the stories are true? The paranoia is suffocating. Your entire position is built on a foundation of confidence and control. You held sway over the king because you were brilliant, desirable, and utterly sure of yourself. Now that foundation is cracking. You start to second-guess yourself. You look in the mirror and, for the first time in years, you see not a queen in all but name, but a woman terrified of losing everything. Why would a woman of her intelligence and status turn to such desperate measures in the first place? This is a question at the heart of her story. We can speculate. Perhaps it began in innocently enough. In the hyper-competitive world of Versailles, everyone was looking for an edge. Maybe a friend recommended Lavoie's and for a simple good luck charm, a harmless superstition. But Montespan's personality was not one of moderation. She was a woman of grand passions and fierce ambition. As she fell in love with the king, an all-consuming obsession. And Louis XVI was not an easy man to keep. His eye was known to wander. For Montespan, the fear of being replaced, of suffering the same fate as her predecessor, Louise de Dovalier cast aside and sent to a convent, would have been a living nightmare. Here's a small, humanizing detail to consider aging. By the late 1672, Montespan was entering her late 30s. She had been through 7 pregnancies. In the harsh light of the court, where new, fresh-faced teenage beauties were constantly arriving, she would have been acutely aware of the passage of time. The very thing that had won her the king, her breathtaking beauty, was a finite resource. It's not hard to imagine her desperation, her willingness to turn to any power, holy or unholy, that promised to hold back the tide of time and keep the king's eyes on her. The historians who believe she was guilty argue that her turn to the occult was not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of her defining characteristic, her absolute refusal to lose. She was a fighter, and she used every weapon she could find. If conventional means were not to guarantee her position, she was pragmatic enough to seek help from other, darker sources. It was not madness, it was a high-stakes power play. Now, in the midst of the scandal, she is trapped. She cannot flee. She cannot confess. She can only maintain a facade of arrogant innocence while her world collapses around her. She has to face the king every day, knowing that he has heard the most violent, humiliating accusations against her. She has to endure the pitying or triumphant looks of her rivals. The final blow comes not as a direct confrontation, but as a slow, agonizing freesiate. The king doesn't banish her from court. That would be too public, an admission of guilt. Instead, he begins to withdraw his favor, slowly and deliberately. He stops visiting her apartments at night. He speaks to her only in formal settings. He has, in effect, placed her under a form of house arrest within the glittering prison of Versailles. For a woman like Montespan, who thrived on attention and power, this public, Silent humiliation was a fate worse than any official sentence. She was being erased, turned into a living ghost in the palace where she once reigned. Her desperate struggle for control had led to the one thing she feared most: complete and utter powerlessness. As the accusations against Madame de Montespan circulated in secret, the atmosphere at Versailles transformed. The glittering palace, once a stage for meticulously orchestrated displays of power and pleasure, became a hotbed of fear, suspicion, and whispered gossip. It was a masterclass in collective anxiety, where every sideways glance and every unfinished sentence was loaded with meaning. Imagine you are a courtier during this period. Your life is a constant performance, judged by the king and your peers. Suddenly, the script has been thrown out. The ground beneath your feet feels unstable. The person you were gossiping with yesterday might be arrested tomorrow. The friendly smile of a rival might hide a new, terrifying knowledge about your own past indiscretions. The news of the arrests in Paris had already unsettled the court, but the rumors implicating high-ranking nobles turned that unease into palpable panic. The talk in the salons shifted from ardent poetry to hushed, frantic speculation. Who was on Lorraine's list who had been foolish enough to visit Lovois, and people started frantically retracing their steps, remembering every fortune they'd ever consulted, every remedy they'd ever consulted, every remedy they'd ever bought for a headache or a heartache. A wave of what could be called preventive denunciation began. To save their own skins, people started pointing fingers at their enemies. Old grudges and rivalries were weaponized. Did you have a dispute with a neighbor over a piece of land, you could now anonymously suggest to the authorities that he had a suspicious interest in alchemy. Did a fellow courtier get the promotion you wanted, a carefully planted rumor about his wife buying love potions could ruin his career. Intended to purge the kingdom of poisoners, had inadvertently created a perfect tool for personal vendettas. The fear of being poisoned, which had always been a low-level aristocratic anxiety, reached fever pitch. No one trusted their food. At dinner parties, hosts would make a great show of eating from every dish first to prove that the meal was safe. A simple stomachique, once a minor inconvenience, was now a cause for mortal terror. Did you eat something that disagreed with you? Or did the smiling duchess seated next to you slip something into your wine? It was a collective paranoia that frayed the very fabric of court society, which was built on elaborate rituals of dining and socializing. Here's a bizarre but illustrative detail of the times after the scandal broke. There was a surge in the market for poison-detecting objects. We've already mentioned bezoar stones, but now other, more theatrical items became popular. There were goblets made of Venetian glass that were rumored to shatter if they came into contact with poison. There were serpent stones, which were actually prehistoric shark teeth, believed to sweat or change color in the presence of toxins. A nobleman might stir his soup with a fossilized shark tooth, a gesture that was both a practical precaution and a paranoid piece of theater. The central drama that everyone watched with bated breath was the silent, public dissolution of the relationship between the king and Madame de Montespan. Everyone knew something was profoundly wrong. They saw the king's coldness, her forced smiles. They saw him spending more and more time with the governess of their children, the pious and gentle Madame de Maintenon, and with a new, young beauty, Mademoiselle de Fontainges. The shift in power was visible to all, and the court began to recalibrate its allegiances accordingly. The courtiers who owed their positions to Montespan's patronage were now in a terrifyingly vulnerable position. They had hitched their wagons to a falling star. Do you remain loyal and risk being dragged down with her, or do you abandon her and scramble to find a new patron, hoping your past association will be forgiven? It was a brutal game of political survival. This period also raises an interesting question for historians. How much did the average, well-informed courtier actually know about the specific accusations against Montespan? The king had ordered the depositions to be sealed, but secrets have a way of leaking, especially in a place as porous as Versailles. It's likely that the general outline of the accusations, love potions, black masses, was common gossip. The most extreme and sordid details were probably known only to the king and his inner circle. The result was a climate where rumor was far more powerful than fact, creating a fog of uncertainty and fear that served the king's purpose of reasserting control. The Palace of Versailles, designed by Louis XVI to be a symbol of harmony and absolute order, had become a reflection of his own inner turmoil. The splendor was still there, the gold leaf still gleamed. The fountain still played, but it now felt like a beautiful, elaborate mask hiding a grim and fearful face. The sun had cast a long, dark shadow, and everyone was afraid of what might be lurking within it. Into this theater of paranoia, unshifting allegiances, walked a new leading lady, a young woman whose arrival could not have been more poorly timed for Madame de Montespan. Her name was Marie Angelique de Sierra les de Roussily, Mademoiselle de Fontainges, and she was, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful. But more than that, she was the polar opposite of Montespan. Where Montespan was witty, calculating, and a political animal, Fontainges was young, barely a teenager, sweet-natured. And as many contemporary accounts noted, not particularly bright. One famous court gossip described her as being as beautiful as an angel, and as stupid as a basket. She was not a rival for Montespan in terms of intellect or ambition. She was a rival in the one area where Montespan was now most vulnerable: youth and novelty. Mademoiselle de Fontainges arrived at court as a maid of honor to the king's sister-in-law. Louis XIV, his relationship with Montespan already strained by the first whispers of the poisoned scandal, was immediately captivated. She was a breath of fresh air. There was no artifice, no calculation in her adoration of him. It was simple, wide-eyed hero worship. For a king who was beginning to suspect his longtime mauve, white had been a carefully constructed illusion. The genuine, uncomplicated affection of this young girl was an irresistible bomb. Their affair began quickly and, unlike the king's discreet dalliances of the past, this one was very public. He showered her with gifts, with money, with titles. He made her a duchess. This lavish attention was a clear, public signal to the entire court, and especially to Madame de Montespan, that there was a new favorite in town. The sun was shining on a new flower, and Montespan was being left in the shade. For Montespan, the rise of Fontainges was the ultimate humiliation. She was being replaced, not by a brilliant political mind, but by a pretty, empty-headed child. She was forced to watch the king dote on this girl, to see them together at parties and on hunts. She tried to fight back with the only weapon she had left, her sharp tongue. She would make cruel jokes about Fontainges' intelligence and naivety, but the barbs, which once would have amused the king, now only seemed to irritate him. They sounded bitter and desperate. The presence of this new rival is absolutely crucial to understanding the accusations that would later surface. According to the confessions of Lavoie's Unsolved, it was the rise of Mademoiselle de Fontainges that pushed Montespan from the world of love magic into the realm of attempted murder. The witnesses claimed that an enraged and desperate Montespan, seeing her position collapsing, had sought a more permanent solution to her new rival. They testified that she had tried to have Fontainges poisoned. One story alleged that she had tried to send Fontainges a pair of gloves, treated with a subtle contact poison. Another claimed she had tried to bribe one of Font and Jess' servants to poison her food. These plots, if they existed, failed. But the accusation alone was horrifying. It painted Montespan not just as a superstitious woman trying to hold on to love, but as a potential killer. And then tragedy struck in a way that seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. After a difficult childbirth, Mademoiselle de Fontainges' health collapsed. She lingered for months, growing weaker and weaker, suffering from what was described as a great loss of blood and a persistent fever. In 1681, at the age of just 20, she died. The court immediately exploded with rumors. It had to be poison. The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too suspicious. Everyone looked to Madame de Montespan. Even though the affair with Fontainges had already cooled by the time of her death, the king had quickly tired of her lack of conversation. Montespan was the obvious suspect. The official cause of death, determined by a cursory autopsy, was listed as complications from childbirth and diseased lungs, but no one believed it. They believed she had been the victim of a slow-acting poison, the kind that mimicked a long illness. Here is where history and rumor become a tangled mess. Was she really poisoned? Modern medical historians, looking at the described symptoms, have suggested a range of possibilities. She could have died from a postpartum infection, a ruptured lung abscess, or even a form of pleurisy. In an age without antibiotics, any of these could have been fatal. The autopsy was also famously botched. The doctors were reportedly drunk and performed the examination so poorly that the results were almost meaningless. The debate over the death of Mademoiselle de Fontainebleau is a perfect microcosm. We have a suspicious death, a plausible suspect with a clear motive, and a complete lack of reliable forensic evidence. The court of public opinion, however, had already reached its verdict. They saw Monty Span as a woman scorned and capable of anything. The death of the beautiful young Duchess became the ultimate, unproven accusation against her, a crime that would cling to her reputation forever, solidifying her image as the dark, wicked queen of the scandal. Her descent was now complete. She had lost the king's love, her power, and now, in the eyes of the court, she was a murderer. With the scandal now implicating his former mistress and threatening to expose the court as a nest of intrigue and black magic, Louis XIV found himself facing one of the most difficult political decisions of his reign. The entire affair had spiraled out of his control. What began as a righteous crusade to purge his kingdom of poisoners had morphed into a direct threat to the stability and reputation of his monarchy. He had to act, not just as a judge, but as a king. His options were limited, and all of them were bad. Option 1: full transparency. He could allow the chambre ardente to proceed without interference. Let them arrest and try every person who had been named, regardless of their rank. This would mean putting Madame de Montespan on trial. It would mean publicly accusing a Marshal of France, the Duke of Luxembourg, of diabolism. It would mean letting the world see the sordid, superstitious underbelly of his glorious court. This was the path of pure justice. But it was also the path of political suicide. The scandal would shatter the mystique of the French monarchy, making him and his court look both sinister and ridiculous. This option was unthinkable. Option 2: a complete and total shutdown. He could dissolve the chambre ardente immediately, burn all the records, and release the remaining prisoners. This would effectively sweep the entire scandal under the rug. But this was also a dangerous path. It would be a blatant admission that the accusations against the highest-ranking nobles were so true that he couldn't afford to have them aired publicly. It would make him look weak, as if he were covering up the crimes of his favorites. The whispers and rumors would continue, perhaps even stronger than before, fueled by the lack of resolution. This left him with a third option, a complex and morally ambiguous middle path. This was the path he chose. He would allow the chambre ardente to continue its work, but only up to a certain point. He would effectively split the accused into two groups. The first group consisted of the commoners Lavoisian, the priests, the alchemists, the fortunateliers, and their lower-class clients. These people were expendable. They would be tried, sentenced, and made an example of. Their punishment would serve as a public demonstration that the king was tough on crime. The second group consisted of the high-ranking, politically inconvenient suspects, with Madame de Montespan at the top of the list. This group would be handled differently. Their cases would be quietly removed from the court's jurisdiction. There would be no public trials, no official sentences. Their guilt or innocence would never be formally established. Instead, the king himself would become their judge and jury, dealing with them privately and politically. This decision marks the moment the affair of the poison ceased to a judicial process and became a pure act of statecraft. Louis XIV, the absolute monarch, placed himself above the law he had created. He decided that the stability of the state, which, in his mind, was synonymous with the reputation of the king, was more important than impartial justice. To execute this plan, he issued a secret order. The interrogations were to stop. Specifically, the questioning of prisoners about the involvement of Madame de Montespan and other key figures was to cease immediately. He commanded La Haine to take all the documents relating to these sensitive accusations, the depositions, the confessions, the witness statements, and lock them away. He created what would become a legendary black box of state secrets. Here's a fascinating detail about the king's control over the narrative. He personally reviewed the evidence against figures like the Duke of Luxembourg. The Duke was eventually brought before the chambre ardente, but the case against him was weak based on the testimony of unreliable and likely coached witnesses. He was acquitted, but the king still banished him from court for a time, a sign of his displeasure. It was a political solution. He avoided convicting a war hero while still punishing him for his suspected indiscretions. The question of why Louis chose to protect Montespan is complex, and historians still debate his motives. It was certainly not out of any lingering affection. By this point, their relationship was shattered. The most likely reason was their children. To publicly convict their mother of witchcraft and attempted murder would be to cast an unbearable stain upon them children whom he had legitimized and loved. It would also be a profound personal humiliation for him, not to save her but to save himself and his family from the ultimate disgrace. This decision was the Sun King at his most pragmatic and most absolute. He was willing to sacrifice true justice for the sake of order and reputation. He allowed the legal process to punish the sins of the masters. The chamber ardente would continue to function, but its teeth had been pulled. It could no longer bite the powerful. The king had wrestled the scandal back under his control, but at a cost. Dark secret at the heart of his reign, a set of sealed documents that would tantalize and frustrate historians for centuries to come. With the king's new orders in place, the very nature of the chamber ardente's proceedings began to change. The court, which had once been a terrifying instrument of investigation, was now tasked with the grim, but carefully managed business of closing the books. Its focus narrowed dramatically. The wide-ranging inquiry into the sins of the nobility was over. The court was now a stage for the final act of the low-level players, a piece of political theatre designed to show the public that justice was being done, while carefully avoiding the most inconvenient truths. The trials that followed were a strange mix of rigorous prosecution and deliberate omission. When it came to the commoners in the network, the likes of the poison maker Marie Boss or the various Fort Nutiliers, who had been swept up in the initial raids, the court was merciless. The evidence against them was presented, their crimes were detailed, and the sentences were swift and harsh. They were the scapegoats, the public face of the scandal. But whenever a trial threatened to touch upon the forbidden names, a strange thing would happen. The judges, acting under the king's secret instructions, would steer the questioning away from dangerous territory. A witness might begin to talk about a powerful client, and the prosecutor would suddenly cut them off, changing the subject. It was a manipulated, censored version of justice. The full story was never allowed to be told in open court. The most high-profile trial to be affected by this new policy was, of course, that of Mauvoisin herself. Her trial began in early 1680. It was a spectacle. Despite the official secrecy of the chamber ardente, the general details of her case were the talk of Paris. She was the witch at the center of it all, and her fate was a subject of intense public interest. Mauvoisin, however, was not going to go quietly. She knew the king had ordered the cover-up regarding Montespan. She understood that her knowledge of that affair was her last, desperate bargaining chip. During her trial, she engaged in a dangerous game of brinkmanship. She would drop hints, make veiled allusions to people much greater than I, and threaten to reveal everything if the court sentenced her to death. She tried to use the king's secret to save her own life, effectively attempting to blackmail the monarchy itself. Imagine the scene in that black-draped courtroom. Mauvoisin, no longer the confident businesswoman but a desperate prisoner, stands before the judges. She is questioned about a specific poisoning. Instead of answering directly, she says something like, "If you knew who I have worked for, you would not dare to ask me such a thing." It was a high-stakes gamble. She was betting that the king's desire to keep the secret was stronger than his desire to see her punished. She miscalculated. Louis XIV was an absolute monarch. He did not negotiate with criminals, and he did not respond to threats. Her defiance only sealed her fate. It made her continued existence a liability. As long as she was alive, she was a threat, a living repository of the secrets he wanted buried. Her gambit failed spectacularly. The court, undoubtedly with the king's approval, found her guilty of witchcraft and poisoning and sentenced her to death. Her final days were a matter of public record. She was to be burned at the stake in the Place de Grève, the main public execution square in Paris. They sent priests to hear her final confession, but she reportedly resisted, pushing them away. She remained defiant to the end. On the day of her execution, She was taken through the streets of Paris in a cart. She was said to be drunk and cursing, a far cry from the composed and calculating figure she had once been. Here's a small, grim detail about the execution. The executioner, in an act of what was considered mercy, would typically ensure the condemned was strangled before the flames grew too high. This detail, the final moments of the central figure in this whole affair, became a point of macabre public discussion. The trial and execution of Lavoisier served its political purpose perfectly. It provided a dramatic and public conclusion to the affair. The evil which had been caught and punished. The king had cleansed his city. The public had its spectacle and its sense of closure. The trial had been a carefully edited show. The real story, the story of the powerful clients who had fueled her entire industry, had been deliberately suppressed. And while Lavoisier burned, the greatest of her alleged clients remained safe, protected by a wall of royal silence. With the execution of Lavoisier, the public face of the scandal was gone. The king had his high-profile conviction, the symbolic cleansing of the kingdom. Now all that remained was the grim task of house-cleaning. The Chambre Ardente continued its work for another 2 years, methodically processing the remaining cases, but its energy and purpose were gone. It was now an instrument for tying up loose ends and burying secrets. The fate of the central figure, the woman who had started it all, was a stark lesson in the king's justice. Lavoisier, the mastermind, was dead. Her final, fiery moments in the Place de Grève were a brutal and public warning. But what of the others? What happened to the vast network she had built? The court handed down dozens of sentences. The lesser figures, the small-time fortune hoteliers and charm sellers who had been swept up in the initial raids, often got off relatively lightly by the standards of the day. Many were banished from Paris or sent to provincial prisons for a few years. They were the small fry, their crimes minor enough to be dealt with through exile or short-term incarceration. But for the key players, the ones who knew too much, a different fate was reserved. The priests, like Abbé Gui Borg, and the main alchemists and poisoners, like Adam Lesage, were deemed too dangerous to execute. A public execution would give them a final platform from which they might shout out inconvenient names. It was a risk the king was not willing to take, but they were also too dangerous to set free. So Louis XVI issued a series of secret orders known as letters de cachet. These were royal warrants for imprisonment, signed by the king, that allowed a person to be imprisoned indefinitely without trial. They were the ultimate to love absolute monarchy. There was no appeal, no recourse to an mandate. You were simply taken, and you disappeared. Gui Borg, Lesage, and several dozen of the most compromised prisoners were sent to remote, grim fortresses scattered across France, places like the Château d'If, the island prison famous from the Count of Monte Cristo, or the lonely citadel of Besançon. They were condemned to perpetual, solitary confinement. They were to have no contact with the outside world, no visitors, no letters. They were held under aliases, their true identities erased, silenced forever to protect the secrets of the king. Here's a chilling detail about their imprisonment. The prison governors were given strict instructions these prisoners were never to speak to anyone, not guards, not priests, about their past crimes or the people they had worked for. If they attempted to do so, they were to be severely punished. The silence was absolute. The king was not just imprisoning their bodies, he was imprisoning the truth itself. The story of one of these prisoners, a woman named Marie de la Geston, illustrates the grimness of their fate. She was one of the poisoneresses in the network. She was imprisoned and held for over 3 decades, long after the scandal had faded from memory. She grew old and died in prison, a forgotten relic of a buried affair. Historians debating the ethics of Louis XVI's actions often point to these prisoners. Was a lifetime of silent, solitary confinement a more merciful fate than a swift execution, or was it a more cruel and unusual punishment? A living death designed not for justice, but for political expediency. The Chambre Ardente itself was finally, officially dissolved in July 1682. The king declared the matter closed. He had navigated the crisis. He had punished the guilty, or at least, the ones he could afford to punish. He had silenced the dangerous, and he had protected the reputation of the crown. On the surface, it was a victory for royal authority, but the affair left deep scars. It had revealed a terrifying knot at the heart of French society. The belief in magic and the casual recourse to poison were not just the superstitions of the ignorant poor, they were an integral part of the worldview of the educated, wealthy elite. The scandal had exposed the raw, brutal ambition that lurked just beneath the polished veneer of courtly manners. It also changed the king. The affair seemed to accelerate a shift in his personality, from the pleasure-loving son king of his youth to a more sober, devout, and suspicious ruler in his later years. The betrayal and the sordidness of it all had taken a toll. He had been forced to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, not in his enemies, but in his own court, among the people closest to him. The golden age of Versailles would continue, but something of its bright, innocent confidence had been extinguished forever, replaced by the long, cold shadow of the poisoned scandal. While the commoners in the network faced exile, prison, or the executioner's pyre, the aristocratic clients, the ones whose names were whispered in the dungeons, but never spoken in open court, met a very different set of fates. Their punishment, if it came at all, was not delivered by a judge, but by the king himself, and it was dispensed not with legal rulings, but with the subtle, powerful tools of royal favor and disfavor. For most of the nobles on Lorraine's secret list, the punishment was simply a quiet, professional setback. The king would pass them over for a promotion they had been expecting. A coveted military command would go to someone else. An invitation to the exclusive gatherings at the king's private retreat at Marly would not arrive. These were not official sanctions, but everyone at court understood what they meant. They were a sign that you were in the cold, that your reputation was tarnished. In the high-stakes world of Versailles, where proximity to the king was everything, this was a serious blow. It was a form of social and political death. Some of the more seriously implicated figures faced a more direct, though still private, punishment. The Duke of Luxembourg, the celebrated war hero who had been acquitted by the Chambre Ardente, was still banished from court for a period. It was the king's way of saying, "The court may not have been able to prove your guilt, but I do not believe you are innocent." He was eventually allowed to return, his military genius being too valuable to waste, but the stain on his reputation remained. The case of the Duchess of Bouillon provides a wonderfully theatrical example of aristocratic defiance. A beautiful, witty, and notoriously flirtatious woman, she was accused of visiting Louvois and unparticipating in rituals to get rid of a rival. When she was summoned for questioning by Lorraine, she treated the whole affair as a great joke. She arrived at the court dressed to the nines, charming and disarming everyone with her wit. When Lorraine asked her if she had seen the devil during one of the alleged rituals, she famously replied, "I am looking at him right now. He is old, ugly, and disguised as a minister of state." She essentially mocked the court out of countenance. The king, amused by her audacity, but still needing to make a point, exiled her to her country estates for a while. It was a slap on the wrist, a temporary rustication, not a serious punishment. This highlights a crucial aspect of the affair, the immense class privilege that shielded the nobility. While a commoner like Marie Bosse was tried and executed for boasting about selling poisons, a duchess could mock the chief investigator and get away with a short holiday in the countryside. The law was not blind, it was acutely aware of social status. This disparity is something historians often emphasize. When analyzing the affair, it was as much a story about class as it was about crime. And there were those who were simply too powerful, or whose disgrace would be too inconvenient to punish at all. Then the matter was dropped. The king knew, they knew the king knew, and this shared, unspoken knowledge was its own kind of leash. They would owe the king their silence and their unwavering loyalty forever. Here's a small detail that shows how the scandal lived on in the shadows. For years after the Chambre Ardente was dissolved, the poisons list remained a potent political weapon. A courtier who fell out of favor might suddenly find rumors of his connection to the affair being revived uncirculated by his enemies. The scandal became a permanent part of the political landscape, a ghost that could be summoned to haunt anyone who had even the slightest connection to it. The overall outcome for the nobility was a strange one. On one hand, a few were disgraced, and many more were frightened into better behavior. The casual use of fortnightly essence potion makers certainly declined at court. On the other hand, the fact that the vast majority of aristocratic clients escaped any real, lasting punishment sent a clear message in the France of Louis XIV. There was one justice for the poor and another for the powerful. The king had prioritized the stability of his court and the image of his nobility over the principle of equal justice. He had contained the scandal, but in doing so he had reinforced the very hierarchies and privileges that had allowed it to fester in the first place. The great purge ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, aristocratic sigh of relief. And what of the woman at the very center of the storm, Madame de Montespan? Her fate was perhaps the most peculiar and psychologically complex of all. She was never tried, never formally accused, never officially punished. But in the silent and forgiving court of the king's opinion, she was condemned. Her sentence was to live out the rest of her days as a ghost of her former self, a living monument to a buried scandal. Louis XIV, for the sake of his children and his own reputation, could not banish her entirely. To send her away would be a public admission of her guilt, so he devised a more subtle and in some ways, more cruel punishment. She was allowed to keep her opulent apartments at Versailles. She retained her title and her vast wealth. On the surface, nothing had changed. She was still the Marquise de Montespan, a high-ranking member of the court. But her power, the very essence of her existence, was gone. The king ceased all private relations with her. He treated her with a polite, icy formality that was more damning than any public outburst of rage. He had moved on. His affections were now divided between the young, tragic Mademoiselle de Fontaines and, more significantly, the governess of his children with Montespan, Madame de Maintenon. The rise of Madame de Maintenon was the ultimate, bitter irony for Montespan. Maintenon was everything Montespan was not: pious, discreet, and morally upright. She had been Montespan's employee, the woman she had trusted to care for her children. Now, this same woman was capturing the king's heart, not with dazzling beauty or sharp wit, but with quiet companionship and spiritual guidance. Montespan had been replaced, not by another glittering mistress, but by a figure of virtue. She had lost the game to the one person she had never even considered a rival. Her daily life at Versailles became a form of gilded purgatory. She had to watch as the courtiers, who had once flocked to her, now streamed to the apartments of Madame de Maintenon. She had to endure the sympathetic, pitying looks of those who had once envied her. She, who had lived for the spotlight, was now forced to live in the shadows. Here's a small, poignant detail about her later years at court. She threw herself into lavish charitable works and patronage of the arts. She commissioned buildings, sponsored writers like Corneille and La Fontaine, and gave enormous sums to hospitals and convents. Historians are divided on her motivation. Was this a genuine turn towards piety and good works, an attempt to atone for her past sins, or was it a desperate, public performance of virtue, an attempt to rewrite her own narrative and win back some measure of public esteem? It was likely a complex mixture of both. She was trying to build a new identity for herself, one that could overshadow the dark rumors that would always cling to her name. She clung to her position at court for as long as she could, for a full decade after the scandal broke. It must have been an agonizing existence. Why did she stay? Perhaps she hoped that the king's anger would eventually soften. Perhaps leaving felt like a final admission of defeat, and her pride would not allow it. Or perhaps, quite simply, there was nowhere else for her to go. Versailles was the only world she knew. Finally, in 1691, she accepted the inevitable and left the court. She was 50 years old. She retired to a convent in Paris which she had generously endowed, the convent of Saint Joseph. She did not become a nun, but lived there as a lay resident, in a state of luxurious retirement. Her last years were spent in a flurry of religious devotion. She wore rough, penitential undergarments beneath her fine clothes. She fasted regularly on spent hours in prayer. She continued her extensive charitable work. It was a complete transformation from the pleasure-loving, ambitious mistress of her youth. The question that hangs over this final chapter of her life is one of sincerity. Did she truly find God, or was she simply terrified of divine judgment for the things she had or had not done? We can never know the state of her soul, but her actions paint a picture of a woman desperately seeking redemption. She died in 1707, almost 30 years after the scandal first erupted. The king, upon hearing of her death, reportedly showed no emotion. He simply remarked, "She has been dead to me for a long time." It was a cold, final epitaph for the woman who had once been the great love of his life, a woman whose ambition and desperation had inadvertently triggered the greatest scandal of his reign. Her story serves as a tragic postscript to the affair, a long, slow fade from power into penitence and, finally, into silence. The final, and perhaps most mysterious, legacy of the affair of the poisons was a literal object-locked chest, a black box containing the most explosive documents of the case. When Louis XIV decided to shut down the most sensitive lines of inquiry, he ordered Roanoke to compile all the relevant depositions and confessions, specifically those implicating Madame de Montespan and other high-ranking nobles, and seal them away. This was not an act of royal censorship. This locked box became one of the most protected and whispered about state secrets in all of France. It contained the raw, unfiltered story, the parts of the narrative that were too dangerous to be told. The king kept this information under his personal control, a cache of political dynamite that he could use to ensure the loyalty of those implicated, and a secret he was determined to take to his grave. For the rest of his long reign, which lasted until 1715, those documents remained under lock and key. The affair faded from public memory, becoming a dark, half-forgotten legend. The king had successfully buried his secret. But secrets have a way of outliving the people who keep them. After Louis XIV's death, the Regency government that ruled for the young Louis XV was faced with a dilemma. What should they do with this infamous box of secrets? Some officials argued that the documents should be preserved for the historical record. Others, more pragmatically, argued that they were a permanent stain on the monarchy and a source of potential blackmail against the descendants of the families involved. The potential for scandal was still potent, even decades later. Finally, in 1725, a decision was made. Louis XV, or more likely his ministers acting in his name, ordered the box to be brought out and its contents officially destroyed. A small group of high-ranking officials gathered to witness the act. They opened the chest and, one by one, fed the parchments into a great fire. They watched as the ink faded and the paper turned to ash, taking with it the definitive, first-hand accounts of the scandal's most shocking secrets. They were trying to erase history, to perform a final, definitive act of cleansing. But here is where the story takes a fascinating turn, a little gift to future historians. One of the men present at this burning was, thankfully for us, a diligent and curious archivist. It was none other than the chief of police, the successor to Roanoke. Before the official burning, he and some of his colleagues had secretly spent several days going through the documents, making detailed summaries and even copying some of the most important passages verbatim. They understood the historical importance of what they were about to destroy. They created a summary of the black box, a condensed version of the forbidden knowledge. This act of clandestine preservation is a small miracle. It means that while the original documents were lost, the essence of their contents survived. It is from these summaries, these notes on the burned papers, that historians have been able to piece together the story of Montespan's involvement. This is why we have the detailed accounts of the Black Masses and the accusations of attempted murder. Without this act of archival rebellion, the full extent of the accusations against the king's mistress would be nothing more than speculation. This, of course, raises a critical question that historians still wrestle with today. How much can we trust these summaries? Did the archivists copy everything accurately? Did they inject their own biases or interpretations into their notes? Is it possible they sensationalized certain details? We are, in effect, reading a second-hand account of a story that was already based on coerced and questionable testimony. It's a history built on layers of uncertainty, a truth seen through a dark and smoky glass. The decision to burn the files shows how terrified the French monarchy remained of this scandal. Long after its protagonists were dead, it was a wound that they felt could be reopened at any time. The burning was an attempt to cauterize it once and for all. By preserving the summaries, the archivists ensured that the ghost of the affair would continue to haunt the French court. The locked box was gone, but its contents, in a more fragmented and mysterious form, survived, leaving us with a tantalizing, incomplete, and endlessly fascinating puzzle. It is a perfect metaphor for the affair itself, a story of secrets, cover-ups, and the enduring power of the written word, even when someone tries to burn it out of existence. And so, with the ashes of the burned documents cooling, our journey through this dark and glittering chapter of history comes to a close. We've walked the muddy lanes of Paris, we've stood in the shadowy salons of La Voisin, and we felt the chill of paranoia creep through the golden halls of Versailles. Now, let's pull back, look at the whole grand painting of the Sun King's reign, and see the permanent, dark smudge that the affair of the poisons left upon it. The reign of Louis XIV is remembered as the Grand Siècle, the great century of France. It was an era of unprecedented cultural glory, military power, and royal splendor. It gave us the philosophy of Descartes, the plays of Molière, the gardens of Le Notre, and the magnificent, overwhelming spectacle of Versailles. Louis XIV curated this image with meticulous care. He was the Sun King, the embodiment of order, reason, and divine right, ruling over a kingdom that was the envy of the civilized world. The affair of the poisons was a brutal refutation of that image. It revealed that beneath the powdered wigs and silken gowns, the elite of this enlightened age were just as susceptible to superstition, jealousy, and murderous rage as any peasant in a remote village. It showed that the highest members of the court, while publicly applauding plays about logic and virtue, were privately consulting fortune utiliers, buying love potions, and in some cases commissioning blasphemous rituals and deadly poisons. The scandal demonstrated that the shining, rational world the king sought to project was, in many ways, a fragile veneer over a much older, darker, and more chaotic reality. The most lasting, tangible legacy of the affair was legal. The Edict of 1682, which severely restricted the sale of arsenic and other toxic substances, was a landmark piece of legislation. It was one of the first major state-led attempts to control dangerous chemicals, a forerunner of modern drug regulation, born directly out of the panic that a few skilled poisoners had unleashed. The age of casually buying rat poison for nefarious purposes was coming to an end. A more subtle, but perhaps equally important, consequence was the damage done to the burgeoning field of chemistry. In the 17th century, the line between alchemy and chemistry was still blurry. Many legitimate experimenters were trying to understand the properties of minerals and chemicals. But the affair, with its tales of alchemists mixing deadly potions in secret labs, publicly and powerfully linked the figure of the chemist with that of the poisoner and the sorcerer. This created a PR nightmare for the young science, tainting it with an aura of criminality and black magic that took decades to overcome. It was a setback for the public perception of science, all because the field's dark ops division had gotten so spectacularly busted. And of course, this brings us to the final, great debate that historians still circle back to: what was the affair of the poisons? Really, was it, as some argue, a case of mass hysteria where a handful of actual crimes were inflated into a vast conspiracy by the use of torture, leading questions, and the settling of old scores? In this view, Monty Span was likely innocent, the victim of a colossal smear campaign. Or was it, as other historians contend, a genuine and widespread criminal phenomenon? A window into the true moral state of the ancien regime. In this interpretation, the confessions, however obtained, revealed a real and terrifying truth: that poison had become a tool for the ambitious and the desperate, and that the glittering court of the Sun King was rotten to its core. A third view sees the affair primarily through a political lens. In this reading, Louis XIV, a master politician, used the scandal as a divine opportunity. He allowed the investigation to proceed just far enough to terrify his unruly nobility, reminding them of his absolute power over their lives and reputations. He then expertly managed the fallout, using the affair to purge his court, solidify his control, and emerge more powerful than ever. The trials were not about justice, they were an exercise in political theater. The most likely truth, of course, is a messy and uncomfortable combination of all three. There were real crimes which were then magnified by hysteria and paranoia, and the entire situation was ultimately exploited by a brilliant and ruthless monarch for political gain. The Sun King built Versailles as a monument to light, order, and his own glory. He wanted to create a world that ran with the perfect, predictable precision of a clockwork machine. But the affair of the poisons was the ghost in that machine. It was a reminder that you can gild the walls and polish the floors, but you can't control the darkness in the human heart. And perhaps the greatest legacy of the affair is that simple, enduring lesson: the brighter the sun, the deeper and darker the shadows it casts. And now the story is over. The echoes of the chambre ardente have faded away. The whispers in the halls of Versailles have fallen silent. You can feel the weight of that history begin to lift, dissolving like mist in the quiet of your room. The journey is done. Let your mind drift away from the dark alleys and the gilded cages. Let the names and the faces soften and blur, becoming part of a distant, half-remembered dream. Feel the gentle pull of sleep, a soft current drawing you away from the shore of wakefulness. The faint hum of the fan is just the sound of the world breathing a steady, peaceful rhythm. The tension in your shoulders can release now. The thoughts of your day can be set aside, placed carefully on a shelf until morning. There is nothing left to do, nothing to solve. Imagine you are floating in a calm, quiet space. The darkness behind your eyes is not the darkness of a dungeon or a starless night, but a warm velvet darkness, safe and comforting. It is the darkness of deep peace, of a mind at rest. Each breath you take carries you a little further into that peace, a little deeper into the gentle embrace of slumber. The story was just a vessel, a small boat to carry you to this quiet harbor. And now you have arrived. You can let go. You are safe. You are asleep. The end of the article. Good night.